Hello, everybody. This is Cascadia Composers. My name is Kevin Lay, and to this February, this month, we have the honor to have uh, Brian Magill featuring some wonderful writings and thoughts. His talk is called Musings on the Muse: Creativity, Inspiration, and Overcoming Obstacles in Music Composition. Thanks, Brian.
Sure. Okay. So this is what we're going to talk about. Um, and there's the motivation, bibliography, which is not my bibliography. It's actually kind of the resources and particularly the books that I read and took notes on that formed a great deal of this talk. And I had, like I mentioned, I had talked to lots of people, and everybody I talked to said, "Oh, you should read book X," right? And so I had to prune it down a little bit. So anyway, some research and information about what people have come up with, getting inspiration, which I think a lot of this is kind of obvious. I mean, but I'm just documenting it anyway. I think a lot of us do what is recommended here. And then I'm going to talk about four meta habits for productive creativity. And I think most people will be familiar with most of these too. And then finally, what to do when you're stuck, and some strategies and things and tools that people have built and made to help you deal with creative dilemmas. Let's put it that way. So Liz's request came out, and she mentioned that there was a remark there, if I read it correctly, that said that her students were always asking where to get new ideas. And that was astounding to me because I have way too many new ideas to ever make use of all of them. And I really, those just fill up my head all the time. But I thought the topic was really an interesting thing. So I thought, well, I'll poke around a little bit. And then it kind of snowballed from there. So I uh, learned a lot of things and read a lot of books and sort of put together this information about it, the talk and so forth. And I have a lot of this is had some interest from people who are not particularly composers, and some of this and some of my sources are specific to music, but a lot of them are specific are covering any creative endeavor. And a lot of what I'm saying I think applies whether you're a composer, an author of books, a painter, any creative effort or activity that you undertake. A lot of these things will apply. Not all of them, but most of them. Um, so these are the books I read for this glorified book report here. And I'll just make a couple of comments about each book. The first one was John Cleese's Creativity, A Short and Cheerful Guide, published in 2020. This is a wonderful book. Um, and I bought it because I figured even if it wasn't a very good book, if it was written by John Cleese, it would at the very least be entertaining. And it is. It's very short. Um, and it has some good advice. But it's not specific to composition. I mean, it's really more specific to writing screenplays and theater, which is what John's background is in. Um, the second book was written by Rick Rubin, The Creative Act, A Way of Being. It's a relatively new book. Now, I don't know if anyone here knows who Rick Rubin is, or if you've ever heard of him. Um, he is a sort of guru of uh, popular music production. He's not particularly a musician, although he's got musical skills, but he's a very famous producer of all sorts of popular musical acts, and he's specifically famous for taking people who are creatively stuck and lost, having suddenly had a hit record and they have no idea what to do for their next record. He's very famous for helping those people out. Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way, Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity. This is probably the best known book on the list. Um, I read the 30th anniversary edition, and she was a screenwriter in Hollywood. And then she kind of had this epiphany and wrote this book, and now it's become her complete life. She runs around giving seminars on it and everything. Um, this book Um, this is kind of a 12-step book for people who want to be creative but suffer from low self-esteem. And it's very prescriptive with lots of exercises and specific activities. It's not as useful from that standpoint as some of these other books if you're already a composer. I mean, everyone here on this meeting is a Cascadia composer, and so you don't need to discover that you want to be a composer. You've already decided you want to be a composer, and you're working on it, and you're active, and you're writing pieces, and so forth. And maybe you may have been doing it for a long time. So, but it is an interesting take on the whole topic, and since it's kind of the best known book, I thought I would consult it. And then the fourth book is Twyla Tharp's The Creative Habit: Learn and Use It for Life, which was recommended to me by oh, man, brain. Okay, yeah, just a minute, just a minute. Kevin, it's right here. Um, and this was published about 23 years ago, and she summarized her own book basically. Um, when she said, "This is my book is about this," which is a kind of a 20-year retrospective. She said, "We can all live creative lives if we only stop waiting for our muse to arrive with divine inspiration and instead just get down to work. In other words, you can be more creative if you're willing to sweat a little." And that is overwhelmingly the theme of her particular book. I mean, I would call it work your butt off. Um, and of these books, I think um, the only one I really just I didn't get quite finished with was Julia Cameron's book because it seemed just this not quite focused in the way I wanted to focus this particular talk, so it wasn't as relevant. And then I had another book on creativity called Creativity Incorporated that I stopped on because it's the history of Pixar animation studios, written by someone who was the manager of a lot of the people at the studios, and it wasn't really a book about creativity. It was a book about managing creative people, and which is not to take away from the book. It's an interesting book, but it just wasn't focused on the topic that I was in trying to cover. So I have yet to finish it. So what's creativity? Where does it come from? So my favorite definition is from John Cleese. Creativity is new ways of thinking about things. Okay. And so, but where does creativity come from? And really, there's two answers that people will tell you, and I don't believe one is any more or less valid than the other. Um, the first one, of course, is I would say God or quote the Muse or the universe. It's really like an external force that's feeding information to you, to ideas as you sit there. And this idea is ancient. The muses are all from ancient Greece. And just for the curious, Euterpe is the Greek muse of music, and there's muses for all sorts of other sorts of things. Um, and, divine inspiration has guided many of the most famous composers throughout history. I mean, J.S. Bach certainly comes to mind. And it still guides many people today. People, not just people who write sacred music, but people who, um, are divinely inspired and so forth. And I mean, Julia Cameron kind of, you know, emphasizes the point that if you're divinely inspired, your music is sort of a tribute to God, right? It's expressing your feelings, it's celebrating your religious beliefs, perhaps if it's choral nature. You may be setting words in the Bible or something like that. But it's also your kind of gift back to God, and it's a relationship that you have with the divine, which I thought was very very profound. And the other source of creativity um, that we think about is your subconscious. Um, so people believe, John Cleese is the primary exponent of this, but and I think it's true that your subconscious has got everything you've ever been exposed to just sitting in there somewhere. Has all sorts of ideas, but you can't just order up your subconscious to divulge the key pieces of information you need. You have to sort of tease those things out of your subconscious in the right setting or and so forth. And a lot of what is in here in this presentation is really about uh, using tools, techniques, and habits that let you kind of dig things out of your subconscious or get your subconscious to divulge information and ideas to you so you can make use of them. Because even though they're there, they're not necessarily at hand. So that's my rough definition of creativity. And you know, creativity applies not just to music; it applies to any endeavor, and that's why I really like this definition of its new ways of thinking about things because you can apply creativity to anything. There's a whole set of books that somebody recommended that I didn't read which were all about creativity in the workplace and solving creativity and solving problems and all those sorts of things. But oops, I hit the wrong button. Sorry, just a second. Um, okay, where was I? Page down. Um, so there is some research that people have done, which I thought was a couple of things that were really worth sharing that people have done about creativity. Um, so the first one is what I call the Chinese character study. So they took some volunteers and they put these people, uh, they showed them a bunch of Chinese characters. And these were all people who were not Chinese. They had no knowledge of the language. They'd never seen Chinese characters before, or they'd never attempted to understand them. So they showed them to them. And then 2 weeks later, they came back and they put the same characters in front of them and they asked them to identify them. And people were terrible at it. Nobody could remember whether they'd seen a Chinese character or not, a particular one. Then they did the same research, but instead of asking which characters they recognized, they asked which characters they liked the best without any judgment on what they meant, just an aesthetic preference for one character or the other. And people overwhelmingly preferred the characters they'd seen 2 weeks prior versus characters they'd never seen before. So here's an example of the subconscious having absorbed information and denying the conscious mind the kind of empirical data that they were trying to search for. But from an aesthetic standpoint, the subconscious mind had absorbed the information that the conscious mind hadn't absorbed, and then through this mechanism, they were able to recall or say they preferred something. I thought that was fascinating. The other study I'll talk about, I'm just calling the architect study. So architects were asked which of their peers were the quote most creative architects. So they interviewed people who were identified as most creative, and they interviewed people who were not most creative, and they collated all their responses and kind of looked at their particular habits. And the two major findings from this, things that distinguished the creative architects from the quote non-creative architects, were that the creative architects knew how to play. They like to play with things, play around. And the second thing was the creative architects deferred decision making for as long as possible in the process. And if this is something that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with, but if you think about it, if you're writing a piece of music, you're maybe gathering information. You've decided what kind of music, what form of the music you are going to write. You've decided on what the instrumentation is going to be, and maybe you have some theme or themes that you're you're like, okay, well, this is good. I'll start with this, and you're going on. But the more time you can spend thinking about how you want the music to be before you actually do anything, the the more chance your creativity has to influence what's going on. I mean, you have, when writing a piece of music, in this day and age, an infinite possibilities of things to write. If you're writing in common practice period style, right? Maybe you're writing maybe in the style of Beethoven, or you're writing in the style of Schubert. They had all sorts of nice rules they used, and so when putting a note down on a page or writing a theme or something like that, they the possibilities were somewhat bounded, far more than today. But today you can write whatever music you want. Um, you can write dissonant music. You can write very, very beautiful music. You can write, percussive music. You can have whatever instrument you can dream up in combination you want. You can write something for that. So what happens here then is you can consider the possibilities for as long as possible. Now, this is challenging, for instance, if you have a score called deadline and it's next week, you can't spend too much time. But I thought this was an interesting result in terms of how people, at least perceived by their peers, were creative. Now, the last thing that we have to mention is artist versus craftsperson. So when you compose a piece of music, are you being an artist, or are you being a craftsperson? And there's that famous quote. It's 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration, which I think is about right. Um, and it doesn't particularly matter. So creativity happens everywhere in the production of art. It can happen at, you have some big idea, but creativity happens all the way down to the individual, measures of music in a composition, right? You make choices, and maybe you have an inspiration to do something different or surprising in a particular measure with a particular instrument, or you've applied some different voicing or something. And so those creative decisions get made at, you know, at at every level in a piece of music. Um, from I'm going to write a concerto, right, of some particular length, or I'm going to have three movements, or I'm going to have a B section after the A section where I'm going to change the material and so forth, all the way down to an individual measure. So, but we all have techniques in a toolbox, right, for to craft a result. I mean, our habits as composers is not to apply wildly different techniques at every turn of at every point in the process. Now, the longer we go, we develop techniques, ideas, and sort of tools in our toolbox, and we like to get those tools out because we understand them and we know what effect they'll have. So we'd like to tend to use those. Um, and so, where do people run into problems? Well, some people are highly creative, um, but they're very poor craftsperson people. Okay, they're not very good at crafting things. They have lots of ideas, but when it comes to actually realizing those ideas, they struggle with it. On the other hand, you have also people who are excellent craftspeople, put things together. They're the carpenters. They're happy to follow a plan, but they're not very creative. So you have to have both of these things. You have to have the creativity to come up with new ideas and express them in unique ways, but you have to be able to buckle down and just crank out the music one way or the other, or you will never ever get a piece of work music done. So, ideas are nothing without the discipline and craft to realize them. And I think this is a hard combination to find in people. Um, and I also think that it's why there are a lot of people who become composers later because they maybe always had creative ideas, but it takes them a lifetime to develop the focus and discipline to get things done. Um, so here's a quote from Rick Rubin. He says, "If you know what you want to do and you do it, that is the work of a craftsman. If you begin with a question and use it to guide an adventure of discovery, that's the work of an artist.
Nice.
So ask me questions if you have any questions. So anyway, so that's kind of my little introduction. So I'm going to talk about sources of inspiration, and this should be quite familiar. All right. So, and like I said, this is kind of a summary of the information I read, plus my own personal thoughts about things. But I think the key idea here is if you want new ideas, sitting around and waiting for the muse to show up is inefficient, and you won't go use an artist. You can spend a lot of page up. You can spend a lot of time waiting for an idea to show up. Okay. Um, so how do you get inspired? Well, the way you get inspired is to expose yourself to new things, new ideas, new ways of thinking. In other words, other people's creativity, right? And I'm going to talk a bunch about different things in more depth, but in particular, you take things apart, especially pieces of music, right? So ask yourself, if you go to a concert and you like the music that's being written, ask yourself, what's the composer doing to hold your interest? If you're bored, well, that's another opportunity. Now you can ask yourself what the composer should have done to hold your interest. Why, if you're uninterested in the piece of music, what's uninteresting about it? I I think many useful techniques can be derived from musical forms you would never write and styles you would never spend time listening to. If you always listen to the same music, right, which is maybe reflective of the music you like to write, well, on the one hand, okay, that's great because you know the music you like, you know the music you like to listen to, and then that's reflected in the music you like to write. So you're in a very good, happy world, right? But if you want to have different ideas and deliver unique musics and so forth, then you have to step out of your own comfort level and your own things you're used to listening to and watching, and take on get some new stimulation into your mind. Um, Forage widely, ingest cautiously. Um, and we'll talk about a little bit more of that. And there are lots of examples. I'm just going to cite two of them here, um, of composers in the past having exposing themselves to new things or new places or so forth, and having it profoundly influence their music and the compositions that they've written. So the first one, of course, is Debussy. As a relatively young man, um, he went to the Paris Exposition of 1889, and at the Paris Exposition there was a gamelan orchestra from Indonesia, and he was fascinated by it. And if you go listen to his music after that, he had a real preference for the kinds of sounds, tonalities, and textures that you hear in gamelan music, um, are very obvious in the subsequent music that he writes. So it is sort of ethereal kind of floating quality, which you get from, say, from a pentatonic scale, for instance. A pentatonic scale gives you this very floating kind of harmony where it doesn't feel like it doesn't resolve. You get rid of the sort of seven, the sharp seven chord or note in the scale. So anyway, that's an example. And then the other one, of course, is Dvorak comes to America, writes his most popular string quartet, and in that string quartet, you hear Dvorak writing and using a lot of the same techniques he's used in previous ones, but he also seems to vacuum up some sort of unique Americana or American kinds of melodies. I think of people like Stephen Foster, right? Now, I don't think that um, the American String Quartet sounds like Stephen Foster, but there's a certain kind of uh, choice or thoughts around the harmony and the themes that go through there that you can kind of trace back to American music, right? So uh, those are, and there's many, many, many more examples of composers uh, encountering something they were unfamiliar with and having it influence their uh, music going forward. So specifically, Twyla Tharp has something she calls scratching, and this is a sort of more overt, deliberate attempt to go take in new sources of information and things from a perspective of generating new creative ideas. So, you can watch a movie, read a book. Innumerable books can be inspiring. She says, watch people in cafes, stare at buildings, go on vacation, which is a really good one. That's basically what Dvorak did when he came to America. He sort of on a big vacation. Read a news story, go to a museum. Basically anything, activity that's not writing music, or you can think of as something that um, is a source for inspiration. You can listen to a genre of music you're not familiar with, see what you can get out of it. But I want to call it one specific thing because it has been the source of so much inspiration for compositions over the years. It kind of stands on itself, on its own, which is to visit nature, to go to beautiful places, go to national parks, go to majestic and amazing vistas, and be inspired by the beauty and majesty. There's one trick for coming up with new inspiration that anyone can do that I think has been used by so many different people is um, visit some place that's inspiring, and then come back and take that feeling and that thing that it made you and the experience that you had and try to express that in music. So that's an easy one. But I think the next point is very important too, which is don't do this as a disinfected or disinterested observer. Do it as a creator looking for ideas, right? So go visit. Let's see. Last year, 2025, for the first time. I went to Zion National Park in Utah, and also to Kolob Canyons, which is where you go in Zion if you don't want to be overrun with people. Um, and I have yet to um, make use of that experience to write any music, but that experience is fresh in my mind. I have lots of pictures, and so it's something that's available to me going forward if I need to use it. Um, so uh, this isn't any different than, say, a reporter gathering data for a story or an author who's writing a fictional book, say, involving a trip to the Grand Canyon. So Twyla Tharp in particular is very prescriptive about coming up with, she does dance and she's putting together a dance program. And her approach is to just research it, right? Go out and pretend you're writing a book. But for instance, in her case, she's putting a dance program together. And in our case, we're writing a piece of music. The more information and background and understanding of a particular story, the richer that telling of that story can be. And it can be, you're writing an oratorio or an opera or something, and then there's a lot of research you can do there, right? If you're retelling a historic story, you can read biographies and everything like that. But you also want to, at least according to Twyla Tharp, you want to understand as much context around things and trace the story and the understanding back as far in time, far in history as you can possibly go to sort of get at the kind of nature of this, right? I mean, there are eternal themes in music and art that go back to the beginning of time. And if you can tie into one of those things, into one of those themes, and bring it into the modern context, right? Uh, then you've got already a really good idea for some kind of creative effort. Um, there's I had an idea for an opera um, which I've kind of set aside, but I thought it would be wonderful. There was, if I can remember his name, he he invented two of the most horrible and destructive things in the world. He was he invented leaded gasoline, which poisoned millions of people, and he invented ozone as a propellant, which destroyed our environment. And he did these not because he was a particularly evil person, but because he was an engineer and he was trying to solve specific problems at the time. And those are the solutions that he came up with. If you put lead in gasoline, it gets rid of all the knocking and horrible noises that engines make without it. And so it was a godsend. It just had a really, really bad unintended consequence. So and so forth. And I thought his story was really fascinating because he also, at the end of his life, he became disabled, and he had invented an electric bed to help him get out of bed in the morning and do various things, and had all sorts of pulleys and everything like that. And he actually died because his electric bed went wrong one morning and strangled him. And so he was killed by his own invention at the end of his life. And I thought, what remarkable events. What you could tell such an amazing story, an amazing opera with that. And the place I got stuck was this would be an amazing story, but it'd be an awfully depressing one. And I couldn't come up with anything that was particularly light or uplifting about the whole story. So I haven't, it's sitting on my pile of ideas. Anyway, never scratch the same place twice. Always be changing environments, changing new places, new contexts, new times of day. And this is a very, very hard thing to do because we're creatures of habit and creatures of comfort. And we get comfortable with what we do. And forcing ourselves out of our own comfort zone to get new ideas and new inspirations is a challenge. And then keep track of your ideas. The idea you come up with today, maybe there isn't a use for it right now, but maybe that idea will bear fruit later on, right? But you collect your seeds, plant them as much as possible, and every once in a while, one will bear fruit. Um, so the other thing I want to talk about, sources of inspiration, is improvisation. Now, improvisation is important and powerful in music. Um, it's actually been part of classical music. In the classical period, there was a lot of improvisation, and a lot of performers like Liszt and other musicians who did a lot of improvising. Beethoven was an amazing improviser. Um, that all happened outside the context of what we know of those composers, because what we have of them is their composed works, right? And improvisations, by their very nature, they don't survive any of this. But we also have things like cadenzas, in which it's time in the 19th century. I mean, you'd get to a cadenza, and a famous performer would simply make something up. He'd improvise the whole cadenza, and that was the idea. Nowadays, a lot of cadenzas are kind of written out for people who aren't terribly comfortable with it, which brings us to our second point, which is some people are very comfortable improvising, and some people are not comfortable improvising. Um, as myself, I'm way over on the comfortable improvising standpoint. Um, I would be happy to stand up in front of an entire room full of people and sit down at the piano and just start playing something. Um, but this is also something that's challenging for other people. Um, but just a couple of points here. This is something that could be completely private. So people think of, in terms of generating ideas, nobody has to hear you improvise. It's it's just something you can do by yourself in your house. Like I said, some people like to improvise in public, and there's a whole subgenre of music that's devoted to people who just do free improvisation. Um, but you do something privately, then you can come up with an idea, or you can start you're working on a piece of, especially if you're writing a piece that's for for an instrument with which you are very familiar. You're a piano player. You're writing a piece of piano music. Well, you can just start out. You may have some particular ideas, and then you can just continue past the idea that you have and see what comes out of it. So the advice I have here is record your improvisation. Um, I'll show you. I have one of these. Let's take it out here. I can't see myself in this context, so I'll show you this. This is a Zoom H2N. It's fairly inexpensive. It's a portable recorder. It just records on a little HD card. It can sit on my piano upstairs if I am improvising or working on a piece. I want to play a particular part of it and horse around with it. I can record it. I can go transcribe what I've recorded and capture new ideas that way. Um, I'm not someone who really likes to sit down with manuscript paper and write in front of the piano. I know a lot of people do. It's not the way I like to do things. So I'm very much a computer person. So anyway, but if you record everything, then that idea happens. You don't lose it. You have a record of it. And Twyla Tharp in her originally would do a lot of her own dance improvisation when she was young. She had a healthy, uh, flexible body, and she would just go out and she was designing a dance for her company. She would just dance it herself, and she would improvise to find all sorts of ideas, but then she'd lose track of them. So very early on, she would videotape herself improvising, and then she would uh, take that improvisation and convert it to a set of instructions that she could give to her dancers to show them. So um, here's another quote from Mr. Rubin. To vary your inspiration, consider varying your inputs. Turn the sound off to watch a film. Listen to the same song on repeat. Read only the first word of each sentence in a short story. Arrange stones by size or color. Learn to lucid dreams. Break habits. Look for differences. Notice connections. That's all good advice. I mean, a lot of this really says, if you want inspiration, this is an active process. Right? It's not a passive process to sit around and twiddle your thumbs. It's an active one. All right. So across all 4 books, there were, I call them meta ideas, things that everybody thought was a good idea. That's the best way to put it. And I have 4 of them. Number 1 is what I call beginner's mind. If you're familiar at all with Buddhism at all, we have the concept of beginner's mind. Well, that's kind of like getting back to your child. And I think in particular, it means sort of letting ideas come out without judging them and let them come out. If you are brainstorming, even in business or wherever, you're brainstorming ideas. All ideas are on the table. Nothing is judged. Everything just comes out. Anything that people think of goes up on the board. Everything gets written down, and you make no judgment about your ideas at that point. And then from there, you look at what has been brainstormed or come out, and then you can apply some judgment or some classification. You can combine ideas that are sort of the same. You can look for and judge ideas a little more effectively. So children are naturally creative. Unfortunately, your school system emphasizes a lot of rote learning and memorization, and I'll call it tactical thinking. Several people talk about this. That if you are trying to solve a specific problem, you have tactical thinking, right? You're trying to say put a puzzle together. You're considering possibilities and trying to match things up and so forth. And that's not what you need for creative activity and for creative thinking. What you need for creative thinking is a slower, more unbounded way of of kind of thinking about things. So children lose their creativity. Um, a lot of them do. Some manage to retain it. And so beginner's mind means getting back to and to thinking about being back at the beginning again. And I think mostly it has to do with a sort of a suspension of judgment of ideas and so forth. Um, and I will add personally that any amount of mindfulness and meditation that you can apply to yourself can help very much to restore a beginner's mind for those who have lost it. And I think this is just a matter of putting yourself in the right frame of mind to be creative. So everyone thinks that's a good idea. The second one, uninterrupted focus. And this kind of falls into two categories. Mostly it means to set a working space for what you're doing that is free from interruptions and uh, allows you to focus on the work at hand. Um, as I said, I think you need a separate space. I think I certainly could not have been a composer when I had young children in the house. Now that they're adults, I have a lot more time and I have a lot more uninterrupted time that I can do things. Um, Having a separate space, I think, is important. Um, Writers, uh, other creatives often build themselves their own little studio away from the house, right? And the house is the house. It's a place where they do their living and their eating and the general things of life. But their creative space is an entirely separate space. It's a separate physically from their house. And so when they work, um, they leave their house, which is just for living their life, and they go to their creative space and to their writing space. And the only thing they can do in there, the only tools and equipment that they have in their creative space is what they need to create. Um, that's ideal, but it's not something everybody can do. Um, so people often do that. The other thing that you can do with creative space, and this gets back to inspiration too, is people often go to an entire, go on vacation or to a separate, say, workshop location. You hear about writers' workshops. Well, the writers' workshop is located out in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in like Utah, and you go there and you live in a little cabin, and all you have is, the equipment you need to write if you're writing a book. And that's pretty much the same thing. It just isn't your space, it's somewhere else. And maybe you also have uh, some social time, some ways of reviewing um, and getting feedback. I kind of admire authors a little bit because you can be working on a book, you can have a chapter, you can read your chapter to a bunch of other people, um, just yourself, uh, and you can get their feedback on it. And or you can read a small portion of it. Where if you happen to be writing a symphony, um, you can make the computer play it, but that's a little suboptimal. Um, then you've got to wait for a symphony orchestra to actually play it before you can really figure out what's going on. So a separate space. And then the third thing that comes, uh, which is another iteration of capturing ideas, is capture every idea you have, no matter how crudely. I showed you my tape recorder. You can sing into your phone. I've done that. Keep manuscript paper if you like to write some manuscript paper so you're never too far away. Draw pictures. I've actually made one of the pieces I wrote. It's basically an octet, and the idea for the piece came not from the specific notes that were being written, but from a sense of how I wanted the dynamics in the piece to work. And I wrote the first quote score for this wasn't a score at all. it was a whole series of triangles where height represented volume, and uh, the y-axis represented or x-axis represented time, and it was a series of triangles laid out in different places, almost like a graphic score. Um, but I wanted a certain interaction between whatever instruments they were in terms of when one instrument was loud and when another instrument was quiet. And I wanted to create a sort of continually evolving texture of amplitude. So I drew a picture of it. And of course, that wasn't the final score. Eventually, it became something else, but it represented and cemented the idea about how I wanted the piece to work. What was the overriding idea? Um, as something I just was able to write down on a piece of paper. I think the other key message from most of this is keep your unrealized ideas at hand and review them periodically. A lot of us, well, we write sketches of things, that's good. Sometimes we write sketches, at least I write sketches, and then my sketch morphs into something that it's like, oh yeah, this is, I'll do this, and oh wait, this sketch is kind of gone way off topic. It's not really to do with what the piece I was trying to sketch out. Okay, fine. Here, I'll just save it over here in the ideas pile. But then if you just do that and you never look at the ideas that you came up with like that, you never know when an idea you discarded earlier might be just the right thing for a new piece. So I like this idea of um, going through your little scraps and pieces of whatever you have, and always reviewing them. And of course, there's no reason why you can't reuse parts of previous compositions. That is a time honored technique amongst all classical composers, especially if you've been given a commission and you only have like 2 weeks to write it. So, okay, big idea number 3: set it aside. And this is also when you get stuck. This is probably the number one idea there, but I put it here instead. So I think you have to set something aside if you're working on it and you're going to do that. It has to be at least a day. It could be a lot longer. But the point that's made is your subconscious will continue to work on this piece, right? Because at least I will write on something and I'll get to a certain point and I'm like, okay, well, this is good so far, but my brain has not decided or figured out what the next step is, right? I've got it to this point and I don't know what the next paragraph is going to look like, right? And what's the next measure going to be? So I've like played myself out for the day. So then maybe I'll set it aside, or maybe I'll set it aside longer. So I think that's a great way. When you come back after setting something aside, you always look at whatever piece you're writing with new ears and new eyes, and the perspective that you have on something will be automatically different just from the passage of time. So of course, this can be challenging if you're facing a score called deadline, and in which case you have the additional benefit of adrenaline. So maybe that kind of makes up for it. And like I said before, for other oddities, always periodically visit things that get set aside. If you set something aside, don't forget to go back to it later. And it's a great thing to do if you're looking for ideas for subsequent pieces. You're like, well, I had this thing and I got it to a certain point and I need to go back and take a look at it again. So John Cleese told an interesting story, which I thought was worth repeating. He had written an entire sketch when he was working with Graham Chapman and Monty Python. And he lost it. He couldn't find it anywhere. And so he had to reconstruct it from scratch from his memory. And then later, after he did this, he found the original sketch. So now I had 2 versions of it. And the second version was far better than the first one. And if he had not lost the first version, he would have had a far inferior sketch. So I think this is probably true, but it's a lot of work. Um, you forget the forgettable parts. You remember what the best is, and then your brain will make these different decisions the second time around. I could certainly tell you that as a software engineer, if you have to write the same piece of software more than once, the second piece of software will be infinitely better than the first piece of software. Um, you don't get a chance to do that very often, but it does happen. Only if actually the first version of the software was so completely awful that it doesn't even work. So then you do get to rewrite it. I don't think I recommend this as a technique to increase creativity. It's a lot of work, but I think it is an interesting perspective that your subconscious, you know, has retained a certain essence of it, but your brain is making different decisions the next time around. Oh, I hit the wrong button again. Damn it. Hang on a second. Apparently, I just like that button. Um, Steal from other people. So this sounds a little odd, but let me explain what I actually mean. So the use of themes that are written by other composers is everywhere in the history of music. Okay, until we get to the 20th century, and then it's kind of gotten to be a little bit of a taboo, which I think is kind of a shame. We have so many things throughout. We have theme and variation on the theme by Thomas Tallis. I can't remember which one that one is. Um, you have the Diabelli variations, in which Beethoven actually didn't like the original theme that Diabelli wrote for him because he was kind of an amateur and he thought it was really dumb. And then he made an amazing set of variations out of you know something that he didn't particularly care for. But um, I think it's very important that to study the composers you admire and take from them what interests you. Um, and you could take, take their techniques and strategies and not their melodies, right? You don't want to, you're not literally stealing their music, but um, many techniques and ideas and strategies in music have been around for a really long time, and can be infinitely repurposed by any composer to make and compose their particular music. I'll give you one example of when I first started composing really seriously. I went to a Dvorak festival that was every string quartet that Dvorak had ever written in sequential order, and a few other things too. There were some quintets and a couple of trios, etc. And um, I was I had heard Dvorak, but I didn't. I, there was something about this set of performances that really galvanized me into my appreciation for him as a composer. So I thought, so I'm like, okay, great. Well, you think you're going to be a composer? Let's go get some scores. So I went out and I got the scores for several of them. I think Opus 107 was one of them. And I sat down to really take apart the music to understand what Dvorak was doing to be interesting. And there were lots of things to see, but the one that impressed me the most, that I think really became a tool in my toolbox, was this idea of having a little motive or theme that's fairly short, not something that goes on for measures, but something that's two or three measures, maybe it's just a three or four notes. And then having that passed from one instrument to another in a string quartet, right? Just da 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 da. And Dvorak does this all the time, especially even right at the beginning pieces. And he'll throw these things around and let each instrument have a crack at it, and maybe he'll vary it a little bit, and then he extends the music a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. So that was something that I saw that made a big impression on me, and then that's a good example of this. Um, so the inverse of this is to stay out of ruts. And we kind of talked about this quite a bit already, kind of idea of like broadening your horizons or strategies. Um, So here's another quote from Rick Rubin, who's eminently quotable. Um, he says a useful routine might over time turn into a narrow, fixed way of working. For instance, if I took every piece of music I wrote, started with a little 4 or 5 note theme, and passed it from one instrument to another all the way around, and had a little variation on it, my music might be um, too similar to itself. So to break out of that mindset, your charge is to soften, become more porous as a person, and let more light in. You know, purposely experiment past the boundaries of your taste, which I think is a great quote. Um, you can always come back and take something from that, going past your own boundaries and going past your own taste, and then taking something from that, crossing over and bringing it back to something that is in your taste is a great example of how to get inspiration and raise your creativity. Oh, I left it. It's a duplicate. Okay. All right. What to do if you're stuck? So, what do I mean by getting stuck? Your creative mind has come up with a big idea for a piece of music and you're in the middle of writing it. So you've had some ideas, you have a lot of things in place. You've chosen some instruments, you've got chosen your form, and your craft is taking you fairly far down the path of completeness. And so you have more than one idea at more than one level, right? Just saying, okay, I'm going to write a string quartet. That's an idea. That's active creativity, but it's not enough, right? You need to have ideas at every level of composition. All right. But then you find something you don't like, which is pretty common. You're listening back, maybe the computer's playing, you're like, mm, no, I don't like this part. I need to fix it. But sometimes the solution to fixing a problem is pretty obvious. Sometimes it's easy. But sometimes you try a bunch of things and you're not satisfied really with the result at all. And what you need is to think about the problem you have differently. You need a push or an external stimuli to get you to think about your problem differently. So, how do you do that? Well, you can ask somebody for help. That is always a technique. But, you know, I've noticed composition tends to be a solitary endeavor, and unless you're studying with a composition teacher and you can take your composition into them at your next meeting and say, hey, I got to this point and I'm not sure what to do here, which your teacher will undoubtedly have ideas for you. We still tend to work in, I think, a solitary way. So having a strong community like Cascadia Composers is good. Um, and you ought to have friends that you can bounce stuff off of. I have a composer friend of mine I've known for 40 years. He will tell me exactly what he thinks of my piece, and he will not pull any punches. And if he has an idea about how it could be better, he will tell me. And so I really value his feedback. I mean, like a lot of times when people present music and to us, especially in maybe this forum, um, we are pretty hesitant to make any suggestions or be too judgmental of what's going on because we assume that the composer is presenting something to us, then it's what they want, right? And in most cases, it probably is what they want. But in this case, if I have something I can send something to him and I can take his inputs and decide if I want to accept them. I think it's really important that when it comes to criticism, you always accept the criticism. You always take the inputs and the feedback that people give you, but you get to decide whether that piece of feedback is a valid piece of feedback or not, especially when it comes to works of art, right? Um, he actually told me in my second string quartet, he said, I think you should consider reversing the order of the first and second movement. I thought, well, that was interesting. Why would you? And he's just like, because I really feel that the second movement feels like it should come first. And the interesting thing was, the second movement was the movement that I had written first. it had the strongest since the beginning, but I had moved to be the second movement after writing what became the first movement. And he was picking up on the fact that what my subconscious mind had done was actually had um, made a mistake. I had moved the first and second movement to be opposite of each other, and they really didn't. They shouldn't have been there. They should be back in the order that I wrote them, not in the order that I had decided to put them. So anyway, have people you can bounce stuff off of. I will say I would love to see more of this kind of more workshopping activities as part of Cascadia Composers, where people can bring partially finished works, or people who aren't sure what the next step is, people who are feeling insecure about whether they've written a good piece of music or not, which is me. um, so want other people's feedback on something that maybe isn't completely finished. Maybe it's of a particular form in some way. It's to a certain step, but it doesn't mean you're, you know, uh, completely accepting of its current form, and have people be able to bounce things back and forth. So anyway, that's another idea, but um, all these things are involving in getting outside input. The other thing, which I'm going to talk about, is really kind of the last thing I have to talk about here, are something called oblique strategies. Um, so I'm going to talk about oblique strategies, the history of these, and also I'll talk about my own oblique strategies. So this was a deck of cards that was developed by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt about 50 years ago for use when they got stuck in their creative processes. And it was a physical deck of cards, and they would draw a card when they got stuck, and they would consider their dilemma in the context of whatever the card had to say. I think it's probably a little like using the I Ching, right? If you're familiar with is everybody familiar with the I Ching? Doesn't know what it is. Okay. Um,
I'm
it's
not.
a, okay. It's an ancient book of Chinese wisdom in which you uh, traditionally you throw yarrow stalks, and you typically use coins now, and you throw these coins out, and the coins give you some numbers, and you form these hexagrams. There are 64 possible hexagrams of 6 lines. Um, some lines are what they call fixed, and some lines are what they call moving. And then there is a book that tells you something about, tells you which hexagram you've ended up with, and if you have moving lines, those lines flip from being a broken line to a solid line, and that creates a different hexagram. It's called the Book of Changes, so it means you ask it about a change that you're considering, and it gives you very broad advice. So if you go on the internet, you can find I Ching and instructions for doing it and so forth. It's been translated from the Chinese a couple of times, and it simply gives you advice in a very broad sort of way, almost horoscope-like. And it kind of tries to tell you whether your change that you're planning is advisable or not. And it can be very interesting. It's broad enough and ambiguous enough that you can apply it to virtually any decision you're trying to make. And it is very good at making you think about whatever decision you are making a little bit differently. So it's a little like that, much simpler. So you bought a card. You could actually buy them originally. They put out, there have been 5 separate editions. It's now available for almost all digital platforms. I have a copy of it on my phone, and I can randomize it. So I just open my phone up to the oblique strategies, shake my phone in the air, or swipe it, or something like that, and it'll come up with a random card for me to read and consider. So what do these cards say? My favorite one is honor thy error as hidden intention. That's one of my favorite ones. And as I was making the presentation, I threw it. I asked oblique strategies for 4 separate cards, and the ones that they came up with were: do the words need changing? Look closely at the most embarrassing details and amplify them. do something boring, or use unqualified people. Now, been a great admirer of the oblique strategies over the years, um, but they have some problems. I mean, if you're a composer. So the problem with the oblique strategies is that they're not specific to any single art form. And so some of the cards aren't simply relevant, or you can stare at them and really have no idea what to do with them. So what I have been working on is my own set of oblique strategies focused specifically on composing. And some of them are very general, um, and some are very specific to a score or a musical transformation. And here's a few that I randomly selected. Um, so some things are things like pause briefly, then resume. There might be nothing to change except your viewpoint. Consider what might be unnecessary. Uh, put some A into B and some B into A. Inversion, or redistribute pitch classes. So you can see some of these are not really uh, musical specifically, but some are pretty specific to a musical score. You can't really redistribute pitch classes if you're painting a picture. So anyway, um, so I have those, and in the backup of this presentation, I have all 90 of the cards I have written. I'm currently trying to decide how to make these into something that is usable by other people. Let's put it that way, if should they desire to do so. Uh, I've looked into writing some software. I thought there would be something that I could sort of write the software of that would be relatively simple. I haven't really found quite the right thing for it. Um, Physical cards are easy. I can have those printed, but if you want one deck, it's pretty expensive. You have to have a bunch of them printed in order to make it cost effective. So stay tuned. I'll see what I can come up with to do for this. So here's some final thoughts. Um, Interesting pieces of advice I think are useful. Constrain your idea to something achievable. Create rules to bound your musical ideas, and then break the rules you just created. It's it's fascinating to me how much good music sets a certain expectation, like a set of rules, and the composer's following them, and then just when you, the listener, have figured out what the rules are and have set your expectations for what's going to happen next, the composer breaks his own rule and does something you're not expecting. Um, Active art exposes a society to itself. Art brings things to light. It illuminates us. Julia Cameron. Um, if you reach a section of work that gives you trouble, instead of letting this blockage stop you, work around it. Though your instinct may be to create sequentially, bypass the section where you're stuck, complete the other parts, and come back to it. Sometimes the solutions to these difficult pieces will reveal themselves once the overall context has emerged. A bridge is easier to build when you know what's on either side of it. And I think composers often work in those ways. I mean, you can write individual pieces and you can incorporate them into a suite, and then you just need to make the transitions go through. More quotes. Um, so anyway, are there any questions at this point? I've kind of just gone on and on.
It seems like at every point it's like so pregnant for a discussion. There's so many things we could take any one of these things and just talk
Uh,
away. So
uh, that that's true, and that's kind of what I thought we were going to do, but
it's
it
yeah.
hasn't happened.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt your flow, and that's probably how the others felt too. It's like, but maybe
Okay,
we could go back and start looking at different questions and different ways
sure.
that you
I,
put things that I would like to say, why did you put it that way? You know?
okay. Well, can you give me just like a few minutes to make a quick bathroom break, and I will be right back. I didn't expect this to be a problem, but
Okay.
anyway, just give
Yeah,
me
take
like
your time.
3 minutes, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
I think he's put into words a lot of the things that I do
Mhm.
and have never really put them into words, you know. So,
Yeah, there's so it's so um, personal, you know.
yeah, it is.
When uh, it's weird to hear someone else, some of them felt weird to me. Like, that's not how it feels to me, but that's it's perfect, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't I don't I don't consider what I do is right or wrong or or anything like that. It's,
yeah.
so the idea of judgment is another thing that he has in here. It's a yeah.
I find myself doing something that I've been a legal secretary and a paralegal and in various different kinds of law. And just about every one of my bosses, when they put together a brief or whatever, they'll give me something to type, and then they'll have an arrow or something with a box saying, "Oh, put this in here, put this in there," and so I find myself doing that without even realizing it. Like in writing, especially on the computer, it's so much easier to do that because if I feel like something else has to go in here, I'll immediately just put like two 8-bar phrases, and blank measures,
Yeah.
and then later come back and switch them around and all that. It's so much easier than than taking his cut apart things and then stick them in here and put them in there. And this is point A1, this is A12, and all that. Um, so anyway, I have my bosses in the legal field to thank for that type of thinking. It doesn't have to be a set thing that starts with A and go all the way to Z in the right order at the and it's got to stay there. You can jumble them around, cut holes in it, and stick them in here and here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, what program do you use for composition?
Sibelius. I was a finale, a snob, until I yeah until someone pointed out to me the really stupid things that finale does, and and so then and this person switched me to Sibelius. It's so much easier, and it's just like he said, the Sibelius you decide. Let's like when I got my first computer, do I get a Mac or whatever it was called then, or an IBM? And I got an IBM, and this guy at church was helping me put this together. And I had Finale. I was going to use Finale on this IBM. He said, "Well, you can do that, and you can, or you can take this computer back, get a Macintosh or whatever it was called then, and then." Take this software and install it and then start writing right away, or you can spend 6 months learning how to use IBM and how to use the computer. And so anyway, it just that's the way it was with Sibelius. I
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, you know, and he showed me that like one stroke of Sibelius took 5 strokes
Yeah.
of Finale. And what do I want to be doing? Learning Finale or writing music? So
Yeah.
anyway.
Cool. All right, I'm back. More questions or comments? I get
Yeah,
to see.
it's like at the beginning you talk the real philosophical stuff that's so controversial, about creativity and what it
Yeah.
is. And yeah, I mean you were spot on and that but there is you use the word new a lot as if creativity they had to be new ideas. They're often you think they feel like new ideas to me. I mean, and then of course, they're not new at all. It's been done 1,000 times, but it feels new.
Well, that is a really really good point. I mean, the in some ways, a lot of these techniques are aimed at people who simply um, don't have any ideas or creative ideas at all. And I think to me, everyone here, we're all composers. We're all composers because, darn it, we had all these ideas for writing music and we wanted to do it, right? Everybody has, to me, inherently some amount of creativity. If you don't have any creativity, why are you trying to write music, right? Then you have some other motivation besides getting this music that's inside of you, right, somewhere, getting that out and to for other people to hear. So, um, yeah, I think that's part of it. Um, but so I guess I sort of agree with you. I also think, if if you're comfortable, if you write, if you if you've been composing for a while and you like writing music in a very specific style, because that's the style of music you like to write in, and you know, maybe you don't need any new ideas, right? You have all the ideas that you need already, um, and you just need the time to sit down and get the music out. So,
Yeah, sometimes the
So,
stories just feel good to be told if you're telling a story
hmm
in music. Yeah.
oh, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it is. So,
Alex.
um, I I found the presentation extremely interesting, informative. This part about the oblique techniques is completely new to me,
oh
and
yeah, hmm
more into the I Ching. But something came up at the very beginning. You were talking about this experiment with the Chinese
yeah,
All
letters,
right. Yeah.
and the fact that people liked the familiar characters because even if they didn't remember them, they saw them before.
that's right.
And that brings me to, we are trying to be creative and create new forms of music and new harmonies and new.
hmm
And then when these things get performed, the public likes the familiar because that's how the brain is built
That's true.
to recognize familiar patterns. So if if I create something that is very unfamiliar, it will not communicate. The people's brains will be blocked. It's too far away from the familiar.
I and I think that is a really good point. And I think about, well, because I listen to a lot of there's a lot of good music, but there isn't that much great music. And I I think I spend a lot of time wondering what's the difference between a good piece of music and a really great one. And I think you're right. You have to have some amount of the familiar, right? Because you have to bring the audience with you, right, into your story, right? So there has to be something they're familiar with. Some aspects of your music that are familiar, but at the same time, I think you also have to have some of the unfamiliar, so as to take your audience in some place they haven't ever been before. Um, but then putting the familiar together with the unfamiliar, that's I think one of the most challenging things of composition, right? Um,
Hmm.
yeah, because you're right. If you put things that are too unfamiliar or too far away from what an audience um, is used to hearing, then the audience won't have a way to connect with it, right? Um, I, but I think that's one of the most difficult things about composition is that my personal tastes in music are pretty. I mean, I think they're maybe farther out there, and in the avant-garde than other some of the other composers in this group. And I can write a piece of music that's completely weird, and it satisfies me great. But if you have to ask yourself, do I satisfy myself, or do I satisfy my audience? Are those things in conflict, or are they not in conflict?
Mm.
Um, so you know, it's a struggle. I mean,
Yeah.
I studied with
Amazing.
Gary Noland for quite a while, and we spent a lot of time talking about that. You know, what 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 how much of the familiar versus the unfamiliar do you have to go with? So,
Yeah, I like your statement that mixing mixing them, if you can mix them together, have a blend of that. I think that makes for a nice, tasty soup, you know? Something that's going
yeah,
to challenge people, but yet not alienate them so much. But still, you could be argued that it doesn't matter what the audience wants. You know, you're the mad composer, like a mad scientist up in their tower and creating
you
things for
could.
the sake of science. You know.
But
But I think we have a great example from history about what happens when you ignore what the audience wants, right? Which is serialism, right? So we got to a certain point in the intellectual pursuit of music and harmony and everything like that because we concocted some rules for composition that basically were completely atonal. And I'm not saying there's no great music that was written in a serialist style. There's a few pieces that are really nice, but mostly what happened was that the audience said, I cannot connect with this music, right? I can't, there's nothing for me to hold on to in this music that I can appreciate. And so nobody listened to it, and still virtually no one listens to it or plays it. And the entire thoughts of composition kind of went south,
Yeah.
for 50 years. And then we came back and we said, oh, maybe it would be better if we wrote music that uh, is, a little more tonal and so forth. And we had the reaction of the minimalists who were to me Philip Glass and Steve Reich were the reaction to serialism and so forth. So you have to give something, and I have to say in my own compositions that um, my first compositions were pretty atonal, and the longer I've gone on, I would say the more harmonious the music I've written is become. Um, and people who can kind of affect a mood, it can kind of capture things. Then I'm a great admirer of it. So
Mm. Yeah, though, you know, there was a time though that it's with the people that were writing that, dissonant and things that were only for a small group of people, they didn't care about an
that's
audience.
right. I mean, there's the fame.
They were
Yeah,
heroic, and just going on for some new ideas.
exactly. But to me, ultimately, um, you have to have. To me, there's a certain threshold of the population that you have to be appealing to, especially if you're not, if you're a professor at a college somewhere and you're a tenured professor and you can write really weird music and you can make your graduate students play it and they don't have any choice about it, you're all set. But if you're here, if you're in a form where you've got your typical ensembles, and basically it's at the musicians are in some cases volunteering, right? Or they have to appreciate the music too, right? If you can find musicians that appreciate what you're trying to do and are willing to perform it, that's at least one start. But my experience has been that most of the musicians I'm familiar with have their own musical tastes, and they're somewhat more conservative than my tastes are. So if I want them to play some of my music, I'm going to have to write something that they find interesting and compelling to write. They have to connect to it too, and then they can communicate that, my intent to the audience. Um, so
Yeah. And we all found out about our famous weird atonal favorites somehow, you
Yeah.
know. Uh,
well, it depends on your taste. I mean, I when I was in college, I my one of my professors told me that I was an edge junkie. He said some people are interested in the most extreme expression of the most extreme examples of musical and artistic expression that they are. They want to see how, they want to experience and understand how far you can push an idea in one direction or another and, still have it be music. And that was me. I just I wanted to have all those experiences.
it's interesting.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
I noticed in your write-up somewhere in there where you talked about this boundary between, how do you put it? It wasn't I can't remember how you put it, but learning when you've crossed the boundary.
Hmm.
I mean, and being sensitive. I admire that someone that has done that and played around and taken a piece and maybe pushed it to where they no longer like it, perhaps, or just messed around with it like that. I
I
don't
mean,
know.
I wrote a piece for our spring concert and submitted it. And um, I was a little concerned. I had gone, and this is a great example. I had gone to, this is like the October of 24. My wife and I went to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in October, and you can actually stay at the field station. They have these cabins and so forth. And so we were there for several days and doing bird watching, going through the refuge, and then we drove to the up the Steens Mountains to the Steens Mountain, the top of the Steens Mountains, which is like 9,000 feet. And that made a very big impression on me as the whole. So I wrote a piece called The Great Basin, and it was the first movement is pretty. It's all the sagebrush, the kind of the desolation and the broad vistas and things going on forever, and the openness and wideness of Eastern Oregon just made a real impression on me. So the piece I wrote was pretty stark, and it was kind of a reflection of the landscape that I'd saw. And it was kind of dissonant and slow and kind of stark and everything like that. And but I sent it in, and it was clear from the comments I got back. It was just a little too, uh, you know, austere or kind of maybe it was a little too maybe dissonant wave. It wasn't terribly cheerful, and so it just wasn't what the ensemble wanted to pay. They were like, "This is a great piece," but I mean, their basic comment was like, "This is a good piece, but it's not for us as an ensemble." So I'm curious now. I want to go to the spring concert to see what they liked, right? What they wanted to play.
I got a similar feedback from one of the people.
Yeah,
I don't like sad music.
yeah, right.
You probably express your purpose well, but I
Yeah,
don't like it.
yeah,
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. That particular ensemble is more vocal about feedback. I know.
yeah.
Is that good or bad? I don't know, but
Well,
it's
I
hard.
mean,
It can hurt.
but they are not. They also they're not. They don't hide their own their preferences, right? They're right up front with them.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
uh, I wrote, it was a three movement piece, and the second movement I wrote, I was deliberately. I was like, okay, this is going to be different, and it's a very cheerful movement, and then the third movement is maybe in between and so forth. I told them, I said, well, this piece is too long for the request, so just pick a movement. If you want to play one movement or another movement, if there's a movement you like and you want to just play that movement, feel free to do that. But they found other things they liked, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, it's
But
good that
then
they have to
don't,
make a living at it. It's their,
yeah,
yeah,
It's hard. I mean, like I
yeah.
said,
their,
you have to play music you like, right? And everybody's tastes are different, right?
yeah,
So,
Yeah.
yeah, they're,
And I found never throw any away, and then and a piece that I really liked that nobody else did, sneak it in there, change the title, whether, and all of a sudden, whoa, this is really good. I really like this, and it's being played, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, all right,
yeah.
finally, it took 35 years, but okay.
wow.
Okay, Liz, that's a great perspective for me to have. I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear it. To
Yeah. I was wondering if that's a legitimate technique.
change the title, I think it totally is.
That's
I
good.
have carefully considered the titles of a lot of things, and I think um, that if the title does for a lot of people, it really does influence it. It sets an expectation for them when they come and sit down to the piece, right?
Yeah.
Um, about
Yeah.
what it's going to be about. So a title is a very powerful thing. And when I first started composing, I didn't want to have anything to do with like quartet number one, right, or something. And now I pay a lot more attention to it because, and along with composer's notes. I mean, you don't always get a composer's notes, but um, I didn't want to write composer's notes when I first. I was like, this is dumb. I just want the music should speak for itself. That was my opinion. It's like the users should, the listeners should have sit down and hear what they hear, and they should let the music speak for them. And I shouldn't have to tell them anything about what the music's supposed to sound like. But I realized that a lot of people really like that. I mean, and we were talking about people feeling grounded or connected to the piece of music. If you write some composer's notes and then that's a way of helping the audience connect with a piece of music that they might not be able to connect with otherwise, right?
Mm.
It's powerful.
And I find that I connect with some of my pieces in a different way as time goes on. And yeah. Well, someone told me that all the great composers switch things around and change the titles and all that, but I don't really have any that I can quote. But
I don't know any specific examples of that, but I do think
yeah,
what I just heard the Grosse Fuge played by the last
yeah,
presidential music, and that story is I think is really amusing that Beethoven wrote it originally as the last movement of his quartet, and then his
yeah,
publisher said, no, it's too weird. It's too no one will like it. Okay, so he wrote another one,
yeah.
and now 200 years later, nobody plays the original fifth movement to the string quartet. They all play the Grosse Fuge because that's quote what Beethoven originally intended. But if you go to a performance, what a workout! That I mean, the
Yeah.
last, the quartet's long enough as it is, and then you have like a 16-minute fifth movement, which is, it's very interesting to see
Yeah,
how.
it is. And I found that interesting to get uh, when that was a project that we had in Cascadia a while ago, um, other composers' idea of what that should be. And I
Yes,
had a completely different idea than most everybody did. And I took it from going into modernism, going into a 12 tone or whatever, and instead, some people took it as to go like 6 steps farther into major sevenths and a sort of an almost quasi jazz sound. And so I found that very interesting to see
and,
what.
well, it was very interesting to me because I submitted a piece which wasn't accepted, and when I went to the concert and I listened to the pieces that were selected, it was very illuminating. It's like, oh, I can, because the Delgani, I've gotten to know them pretty well. I mean, my wife's studying with the cello player as a teacher, so I know them all personally. And now that I've been going to enough concerts, uh, it's like they like drama, and I had chosen to write something that was actually quite sort of friendly. It just took a little bit of the Beethoven-esque, and they wanted that sort of stern, dramatic kind of side of Beethoven in a way. It seemed like from the pieces that they chose.
Mm.
So that's the way it goes.
Mm.
I,
Yeah. Oh, it's all interesting. Well, you brought out some really great ideas. And when you went to your bathroom break, and I commented that it's a lot of you what you're saying has put my thoughts into words, and it really is helpful. So like things that I do and don't verbalize what it is.
I agree. I mean, a lot of people, I think if you've been a composer for a while, some of these things, especially the habits that you're doing them instinctively, right? Or you found them out simply from trial and error. They're
Yeah.
not a big revelation or anything. So,
Well, they're a big revelation in being able to verbalize them.
no. Okay. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. I'm sorry we didn't
Yeah.
get too many more people than what we got, but that's the way it goes.
Well, then
There'll be
people will
people.
come and
Yeah,
see them later
yeah.
because
The, it's true. The YouTubes are accessed.
yeah,
Good.
yeah. Well, thanks so much, Brian. I'm going to have
No
to
problem.
close
I'm
up
going to go
shop.
too. All
Okay.
right. Sounds good. Thanks a lot. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Much.
Bye.
It was awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.